The laptop slid across the table toward me like an afterthought. No box. No charger neatly wrapped. Just a scuffed piece of plastic with a cracked corner and a hinge that squeaked when I opened it. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, waiting for the punchline that never came. "That one still works," my mom said quickly, like she was reassuring herself more than me. "Your brother barely used it." Barely used. The screen had a spiderweb fracture in the bottom corner, and a sticky note still clung to the keyboard that said, "Ethan, do not touch." I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. Across the room, my brother was already setting up his new gaming PC. $2,000 worth of glowing lights, multiple monitors, a mechanical keyboard clicking like applause every time he touched it. Tower pulsed in neon colors, alive, expensive, unmistakably new. "Bro, look at this graphics card," Ethan said, grinning, not even looking in my direction. "This thing's insane." Dad chuckled proudly. "Worth every penny." I swallowed. "Can I have the charger?" I asked, holding up the laptop like evidence. "Oh," Mom said, distracted. "We'll have to look for it. But you don't really need it right now, right? You're just using it for emails and stuff." Emails and stuff. I nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining that I worked full-time. That I freelanced. That my laptop had died 3 weeks ago and I'd been borrowing one to meet deadlines. That this wasn't a toy for me. It was a tool. Finn finally glanced over. "You're lucky," he said casually. "At least you got one." Lucky. I looked back at the table. The cracked plastic. The faint smell of energy drinks baked into the keyboard. At the way the hinge sagged, like it was already tired of holding itself together. This wasn't about computers. I knew that instantly. This was about ranking. They had gathered us under the pretense of family gifts, but the message was loud and clear. Investment on one side. Hand-me-down on the other. Celebration for him. Gratitude expected from me. "Say thank you," Mom added softly, the way she always did when the imbalance got too obvious. I opened my mouth. And something in me paused. Because this wasn't the first time. Not even close. It was just the first time I could see the price tag on the difference. $2,000 of belief in him. Cracked leftover for me. I closed the laptop slowly and placed it back on the table. "Thank you," I said. But even as the word left my mouth, I felt it crack, just like the screen. That night, I tried to make the laptop work. I carried it back to my old room, the one that still smelled faintly of dust and forgotten summers, and plugged it into the first charger I could find. It didn't fit. I tried another. Still nothing. I balanced it on my knees, adjusted the hinge carefully so the screen wouldn't flicker, and pressed the power button again and again like persistence alone might revive it. Nothing. From down the hall, I could hear Ethan laughing through his headset. Explosions, cheers, the clack of keys. His room glowed like a spaceship preparing for launch. Mine sat in shadow, lit only by the small desk lamp I'd used since high school. Contrast felt intentional, even if no one would ever admit it. I finally found a charger that fit after digging through a box labeled "Old Cables. Do not throw away." When the laptop powered on, it wheezed, the fan rattling like it had asthma. The startup took so long I checked my phone twice, just to make sure time was still moving. The desktop loaded. Barely. I opened a browser. Froze. I waited. I tried again. The screen flickered, then recovered, as if it was warning me not to push my luck. I sat there, staring at it, and felt something familiar settle into my chest. That quiet instruction I'd been given my whole life. Don't ask for more. Don't complain. Be grateful you got anything at all. I remembered being 12 and getting Ethan's old phone after he dropped it in a pool. The screen had dead spots and the battery lasted an hour, but Mom had smiled and said, "At least you have one." I remembered being 17 and wearing his old jacket to school because he'd outgrown it while they bought him a new one for the season. I remembered being told again and again that I was low maintenance, as if that were a compliment and not a category. At dinner, no one asked if the laptop worked. No one noticed I hadn't joined Ethan to check out his setup. Conversation revolved around graphics cards, frame rates, future upgrades. Dad talked about how this would really help Ethan relax after studying. Mom nodded along, proud, glowing. "And you?" Dad finally asked, glancing at me. "You all set?" I hesitated. Truth sat on my tongue, heavy and sharp. It doesn't really work. I need it for my job. I can't afford a new one right now. But I'd learned what truth cost in rooms like this. "Yeah," I said. "It's fine." Mom smiled, relieved. "See? You're always so easy." Easy. The word landed like a verdict. After dinner, Ethan passed me in the hallway, headset still around his neck. "Hey," he said, almost kindly. "If that thing dies, you can use mine when I'm not gaming." "When's that?" I asked. He laughed. "Good question." I smiled back, automatic, practiced. Kind of smile that kept things smooth. The kind that never asked anyone to look closer. Back in my room, I opened my email and watched the cursor blink, slow and stubborn. A deadline loomed. Client waiting. Paycheck depending on whether this cracked hand-me-down could survive a few more hours. I thought about the $2,000 glowing down the hall. About how quickly and confidently it had been spent. About how no one had hesitated or qualified it with at least. And I wondered when exactly I'd learn to accept less as my default setting. The laptop froze again. I didn't sigh. I didn't curse. I just waited, hands folded like I'd been taught. But somewhere under the patience, something else stirred. The next morning, the laptop crashed for the third time before I even finished my coffee. The screen went black, then blue, then black again, like it couldn't decide which kind of failure it preferred. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass and felt a strange calm wash over me. Not peace. Resignation. Kind that comes from knowing exactly how this story usually goes. I rebooted it one more time and managed to send a quick message to my client. "Running into some tech issues. I'll be a bit slower this morning." I hated how small that sounded. How apologetic. How it made my livelihood feel like an inconvenience. From the kitchen, I could hear Mom humming. The smell of toast drifted down the hall. Normal morning. No tension. No guilt. Just another day where the imbalance stayed invisible because no one named it. I carried the laptop out and set it gently on the counter. "It keeps freezing," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I don't think it can handle my work." Mom barely looked up. "You're probably opening too many tabs." "I need those tabs," I said. "It's how I work." She sighed, the sound sharp with impatience. "You always make things sound worse than they are." Dad glanced over his newspaper. "It's not that bad," he said. "Ethan used it for years." "That was before it cracked," I replied. "And before the battery stopped holding a charge." Ethan walked in, already energized, already loud. "Is it dead already?" He joked. "Wow. Guess it really is ancient." I felt heat creep up my neck. "I just need something reliable," I said. "For work?" Mom turned then, finally giving me her full attention. "You don't need top-of-the-line equipment for what you do." "What I do." As if my job were a hobby. As if deadlines and clients were imaginary. "We spend a lot on Ethan's computer," she continued. "We couldn't afford 2 big purchases." I nodded slowly. "I didn't ask for a gaming PC." "That's not the point," Dad cut in. "You got something. Be grateful." Grateful. The word landed like a lid being slammed shut. I looked at Ethan. At the confidence with which he leaned against the counter. At the certainty that his needs would always be met first, fully, without qualifiers. I wondered if he even noticed the difference or if it had always felt natural to him like gravity. "I'm grateful," I said quietly. "I just can't use this." Mom's mouth tightened. "You're being difficult." There it was again. The shift. From concern to accusation. From problem to personality flaw. "I'll figure something out," I added quickly because that was my role. The fixer. The absorber. The one who made things easier by needing less. Dad nodded, satisfied. "That's the spirit." Finn smirked and grabbed a protein bar. "If you want, I can sell you my old mouse," he said. "It still clicks." I forced a laugh. Everyone else did too. The moment passed. The discomfort smoothed over. The system restored. Back in my room, I stared at the laptop, still humming weakly on the bed. I thought about all the times I'd been told my needs were optional. All the times I'd been framed as dramatic for pointing out cracks that everyone else pretended not to see. This wasn't about money. Never was. It was about permission. About who was allowed to want more. About who got investment and who got leftovers. I closed the laptop and didn't open it again that day. Instead, I opened my phone and started looking at prices. Refurbished models. Payment plans. Questions that didn't involve asking. As I scrolled, a thought surfaced, quiet but clear. If I wanted something solid, something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of my life, I was going to have to build it myself. I spent the rest of that day figuring it out. That was the phrase they loved most. Figure it out. Sounded empowering when they said it, like a vote of confidence. In reality, it was abandonment wrapped in praise. A way of stepping back without admitting they'd never stepped forward for me in the first place. I took my backpack, left the house, and walked to the small cafe 3 blocks away. The one with uneven tables, slow Wi-Fi, and an outlet that only worked if you held the plug at a certain angle. I ordered the cheapest coffee and sat there for hours, trying to do a full day's work on a borrowed laptop from a friend who'd felt bad for me weeks earlier. Every click reminded me how temporary everything in my setup was. How precarious my independence actually felt when stripped of illusion. Between tasks, my mind kept drifting back to the living room. To the glow of Ethan's monitors. To the way no one had asked if I needed anything else. To how easily my parents had closed the conversation the moment I showed the slightest resistance. "You'll figure it out. You always do." They were right. I always did. That was the problem. I remembered the first time I figured it out alone. I was 19, short on rent, too embarrassed to ask for help after being told I needed to learn responsibility. I sold a few things, skipped meals, took extra shifts. When I told Mom later, hoping for reassurance, she'd smiled proudly and said, "See? You're stronger than you think." Strength in our family was just another word for self-neglect. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon. A message from Dad. "Your mom feels bad. But we really did our best." I stared at the screen. Our best. I wondered what that actually meant. Was their best conditional on who they were spending it on? Was it capped the moment it reached me? I typed a reply. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. I was tired of explaining myself to people who benefited from not understanding. When I got back home that evening, Ethan was mid-game again. Shouting, laughing, fully absorbed. Mom asked what I wanted for dinner without looking up from her phone. Dad commented on how fast technology changes these days, how hard it is to keep up. No one mentioned the laptop. I carried mine into the living room and set it gently on the coffee table. Crack caught the light, thin and unmistakable. "I'm going to return this," I said. "Or recycle it. It's not usable." Mom looked startled. "Why would you do that?" "Because it doesn't work," I replied. "And pretending it does doesn't help anyone." She frowned. "You don't have to make a statement out of everything." I almost laughed. This was the statement. Cracked hinge. the dead battery, the expectation that gratitude should override reality. "I'm not," I said. "I'm being honest." Dad sighed. "You're taking this too seriously." Maybe. Or maybe I was finally taking myself seriously enough. I picked the laptop up and carried it back to my room. Not as a protest, as a decision. That night, I lay awake thinking about how often I'd accepted broken things just because they were offered. How often I told myself it was enough because asking for more felt dangerous. Truth settled slowly, like something heavy finding the bottom of a lake. They weren't going to invest in me. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't have to. And if I wanted something better, something whole, something that didn't crack under pressure, I was going to have to stop waiting for permission to want it. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no speech, no slam door, no final declaration. Came quietly, sometime after midnight, while I lay staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint hum of Ethan's PC through the wall. The rhythm of his keyboard taps bled into my thoughts, steady and confident, like proof that some people were allowed to take up space without apologizing for it. I opened my banking app on my phone and started doing math. Not the hopeful kind. The honest kind. Rent. Utilities. Groceries. Transportation. The little subscriptions I'd been meaning to cancel. The freelance income that came in uneven waves. I didn't look away when the numbers tightened. I didn't soften the edges. I wanted to see my life exactly as it was, not as I wished it could be. That's when something shifted. I realized I'd been budgeting for disappointment for years, always assuming I'd have to compensate for something missing. A broken laptop. A delayed paycheck. A gift that came with strings. My plans were built around the expectation that I'd be the last one considered, so I'd better be prepared. I closed the app and opened a browser tab. New laptops. Refurbished. Certified. Warranties included. I filtered by price and felt my chest tighten, then loosen. It was more than I wanted to spend. Less than what they'd spent on Ethan without blinking. I imagined the conversation that would never happen. Me asking. Them weighing it. The inevitable comparison. Ethan needs it more. You can manage. I shut the tab and opened another, payment plans. Monthly amounts. Interest rates. Trade-offs that didn't involve my dignity. In the morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet. No voices. No screens glowing. Just the soft light creeping in through the curtains. I made coffee and sat at the table where the cracked laptop had been slid toward me like a compromise. I thought about how many times I'd accepted compromises that weren't actually compromises at all. When Mom came in, she noticed my coffee and smiled faintly. "You're up early." "Yeah," I said. "I have a lot to do today." She hesitated. "About yesterday, you know we didn't mean anything by it." I nodded. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. "I know." She seemed relieved, mistaking my calm for capitulation. "Good," she said. "I knew you'd understand." Understand. Another word that asked me to shrink without saying so. I didn't correct her. I finished my coffee, grabbed my bag, and left the house. The electronics store, the air smelled like plastic and possibility. Rows of clean screens. Keys that hadn't been worn down by someone else's habits. A sales associate asked what I was looking for. I told him exactly what I needed. Not what I deserved. Not what I wished for. What I needed. When I handed over my card, my hand didn't shake. Confirmation beep felt louder than it should have, like punctuation at the end of a long sentence I'd never finished before. On the way home, my phone buzzed. A message from Dad. "Did you fix the laptop situation?" I looked at the bag on the seat beside me. Brand new. Heavy. Mine. "Yes," I typed. And for the first time, the words didn't feel like a promise I'd have to pay for later. As I unlocked the door, Ethan shouted something triumphant from his room. A win. Another level cleared. Another upgrade unlocked. I carried my bag past his door, past the living room, into my room and set it down carefully. This wasn't revenge. It was replacement. I wasn't waiting anymore. And that changed everything. I didn't open the box right away. I let it sit on my bed like a secret I was allowed to keep to myself. The weight of it felt different from the cracked laptop. Solid. Intentional. Earned. I showered, changed clothes, and only then peeled back the seal, slow, careful, like I didn't want to rush the moment into something ordinary. When the screen lit up for the first time, clean and bright, I felt an unexpected sting behind my eyes. Not because of the laptop itself, but because of what it represented. Proof that I could meet my own needs without asking. Proof that my life didn't have to pause until someone else decided I deserved better. I set it up at the small desk in my room. The chair wobbled a bit, but the screen didn't. Programs opened instantly. Files synced without drama. Cursor moved like it trusted me. I worked for 3 uninterrupted hours and finished tasks that had been hanging over me for days. When I sent the last email, my shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't in weeks. From the hallway, I heard Mom's footsteps slow. She stood in the doorway, eyes flicking from the new laptop to the old one stacked in the corner. Her expression shifted through confusion, surprise, then something sharper. Where did that come from? I bought it, I said, not looking up. With what money? She asked. I finally turned. Mine. She crossed her arms. You didn't need to do that. We could have figured something out. I almost laughed. Figured something out had never meant this. It meant waiting. It meant adapting. It meant me learning to tolerate less. I needed it for work, I said. And I couldn't wait. Her mouth tightened. You're being dramatic. The word landed, familiar and dull. I shrugged. Maybe. But my deadlines aren't. She lingered, clearly searching for the right angle. So what are you going to do with Ethan's laptop? It's not Ethan's anymore, I replied. And it doesn't work. I'm donating it for parts. She frowned like I'd just rejected a family heirloom. That seems wasteful. I gestured to the crack, the sagging hinge, the dead battery. So does pretending something broken is enough? She left without responding. The silence that followed felt different from the others. Less heavy. Less charged. Like something had shifted in the balance of the house. That evening at dinner, Dad noticed. New computer? Yes, I said. He raised an eyebrow. That must have cost you. It did, I replied evenly. He nodded, as if approving a lesson learned. Well, that's what happens when you take initiative. I looked down at my plate. Initiative. The way they reframed my self-rescue as character development instead of necessity. As if the system hadn't failed me first. Finn glanced up from his phone. Is it any good? He asked, genuinely curious. It works, I said. He smirked. Must be nice. I met his eyes. It is. The word surprised both of us. Later that night, I moved the old laptop out of my room. Not angrily. Deliberately. I placed it by the door, ready for donation. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Like shedding a version of myself that had learned to be grateful for scraps. As I went back to my desk and opened my new laptop again, I noticed something else. No one asked me to share it. No one assumed access. It sat there as mine, unquestioned. And for the first time, the glow from my screen didn't feel like a spotlight reminding me of what I lacked. It felt like a window. The attention didn't announce itself. Seeped in through comments, glances, the sudden interest everyone had in my choices now that they no longer controlled them. I noticed it first in the way Mom asked questions that weren't really questions. How long did you say that payment plan is? Are you sure you didn't rush into that? You know interest adds up. Sentence sounded practical, reasonable, caring. Each one carried the same subtext. You stepped outside your lane. I kept working. Longer hours. Cleaner focus. Projects finished on time instead of patched together at the last minute. The new laptop didn't just function. It changed the way my days flowed. Less friction. Less apology. Less scrambling to compensate for things that were never my fault. The difference was so stark it almost embarrassed me. Not because I had improved, because I hadn't been allowed to before. Dinner, the conversation drifted toward money the way it always did when someone felt threatened by it. Dad mentioned bills. Mom sighed about expenses. Finn joked about upgrades. No one asked how work was going. No one asked if the new setup helped. The silence around my progress felt intentional, like acknowledging it would mean acknowledging something else. That I hadn't needed permission. That I'd acted without them. You know, Mom said casually, you could have asked us first. I set my fork down. Asked for what? Advice, she replied. Guidance. Guidance. The word that usually arrived after the fact, once the decision had already been made without me. I knew what I needed, I said. And I handled it. Dad nodded slowly. We just don't want you getting ahead of yourself. I looked up. Ahead of what? He hesitated. Of reality. Reality. As if the life I was living, paying for, sustaining wasn't real until it passed their approval. I felt a familiar heat rise, then settle. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply said the truth. My reality is that I need working equipment to earn money. And now I have it. Finn snorted. Guess you didn't need our hand-me-down after all. The words were meant to be light. They weren't. No, I said. I didn't. Table went quiet. Not awkward. Alert. Like a line had been crossed that no one had realized was there until it was gone. Mom stared at her plate. Dad cleared his throat. Ethan shrugged and went back to his phone. Later, in my room, I thought about that moment. About how quickly pride had turned into discomfort the second I stopped accepting less. How my independence was welcome only when it didn't expose the imbalance they'd built around it. I understood then that my growth wasn't neutral in this house. It was disruptive. That night, I updated my resume. Not because I was planning to leave immediately. 'Cause I wanted options. 'Cause I'd learned that relying on systems that devalue you is a gamble you lose slowly. I applied to 2 positions I would have talked myself out of before. I didn't expect miracles. I expected movement. When I closed my laptop, I caught my reflection in the dark screen for a second. I looked steadier. Not happier exactly. More aligned. Like I was finally standing where my feet were instead of leaning towards someone else's expectations. The next morning, Mom knocked on my door. Softly. She held the old laptop charger in her hand like a peace offering. I found this, she said. In case you need it. I looked at it. Then at her. I don't, I replied. But thank you. She lingered, searching my face. You're really serious about this, she said. Yes, I answered. She nodded once and walked away. No argument. No lecture. Just acceptance, thin and reluctant. I closed the door and sat back down at my desk. The new laptop hummed quietly, reliable, ready. I realized then that this wasn't just about one purchase or one slight. It was about a pattern finally meeting resistance. And resistance, once applied, doesn't disappear. The first reply came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was mid-task, headphones on, focus locked. An email subject line blinked into view. Interview invitation. I stared at it for a second, then another, letting the words land without flinching. It wasn't the job yet. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was confirmation. Movement. Proof that momentum wasn't imaginary. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not because I was hiding it. 'Cause I wanted to feel it unshared first. I finished my work, closed my laptop, and breathed. Quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Dinner, the shift was immediate. Mom noticed my mood before I said a word. "You seem upbeat," she said, suspicious and curious in equal measure. "I had a good day," I replied. Dad looked up. "Good, how?" I hesitated, then said it plainly. "I got an interview request for a position I applied to." Table reacted like a dropped plate. Not loud. Sudden. Finn blinked. Mom's fork paused midair. Dad's expression rearranged itself into something unreadable. "That's nice," Mom said finally. Dad nodded. "What kind of position?" I told them. The title. Company. The responsibilities. I kept it factual. I didn't dress it up. I didn't downplay it either. "That sounds intense," Mom said. "Are you sure you're ready for something like that?" Ready. The words surfaced again, always when I moved without their choreography. "I think so," I said. "They do too. Or they wouldn't have reached out." Finn leaned back in his chair. "Guess that new laptop paid off," he said, half joking. "It did," I replied. The room settled into a strange quiet. Not hostile. Assessing. Like they were recalibrating the story they'd been telling themselves about me. The one where I was capable but not ambitious. Independent but not upward. Reliable but not ascending. After dinner, Mom followed me into the hallway. "Don't get your hopes up too much," she said gently. "These things don't always work out." "I know," I replied. "And remember," she added, lowering her voice, "success brings more responsibility. More pressure. You don't want to rush into something that could overwhelm you." I looked at her then. Really looked. At the concern that only appeared when my trajectory shifted. At the caution that had never been offered when I was scraping by. "I've been overwhelmed before," I said. "I survived." She didn't answer. That night, I prepared for the interview. Research. Notes. Practice answers. My new laptop handled everything without a hiccup. No freezing. No wheezing. No apologies to clients. Contrast felt almost unfair. Like I'd been running a race with weights on my ankles and only just realized it. I thought about the cracked laptop sitting by the door, waiting to be donated. About how long I'd carried things that slowed me down because someone else had decided they were good enough for me. I wondered how many other limits in my life weren't real limits at all, just inherited ones. Before bed, my phone buzzed. A message from Dad. "Just remember where you came from." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back. "I do. That's why I'm going where I'm going." He didn't reply. I slept deeply that night. Not from exhaustion. From alignment. Kind that comes when your effort finally matches your direction. I knew the interview might not pan out. I knew nothing was guaranteed. But I also knew this. My progress was no longer a negotiation. And that made all the difference. The days leading up to the interview stretched in a strange way. Not slow. Not fast. Just dense. Every hour felt filled with intention. I woke earlier not because I was anxious, but because my mind was already moving. Notes to review. Examples to refine. A version of myself I was finally allowing to take up space without apology. Breakfast, the air felt different. Mom watched me over her coffee like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit anymore. Dad skimmed the news, but his eyes lifted more often than usual. Ethan was quiet, which was rare. The house had shifted from dismissive to observant, and that attention felt heavier than the neglect ever had. "So," Dad said finally. When is this interview? Thursday, I replied. He nodded. In person. Video, I said. Mom frowned. That's good. Less pressure. I almost said something. Almost explained that pressure wasn't the enemy. That opportunity required friction. That I wasn't fragile glass. Instead, I let it go. I didn't need them to understand the mechanics of my ambition anymore. Over the next few days, small comments accumulated. Not insults. Adjustments. Finn joked that I'd get bored if the job was too serious. Mom reminded me that stable was better than exciting. Dad mentioned how loyalty to a company mattered more than titles. Each remark shaved a little off the edges of my excitement, not enough to stop it, but enough to remind me how often I'd been taught to dim myself for the sake of harmony. I noticed it most in myself. The instinct to preemptively downplay. To say things like if it works out or it's no big deal. I caught the habit mid-sentence one afternoon and stopped. Let the sentence end unfinished. Let the silence hold what I actually felt. I wanted this. The night before the interview, I stayed up later than planned. Not cramming. Refining. I rewrote my answers until they sounded like me, not like someone auditioning for approval. I closed my laptop and sat back, realizing how unfamiliar that felt. Confidence without performance. Readiness without permission. My phone buzzed around midnight. A message from Mom. Don't forget to thank your father for helping you when you were starting out. I stared at the screen. Helping. I thought about the cracked laptop. The hand-me-downs. Praise for resilience instead of relief. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. I set the phone down and went to sleep. The interview morning arrived clear and quiet. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel like myself. I set up my space, adjusted the camera, took a breath. When the call connected, I didn't shrink. I didn't overcompensate. I answered questions directly. I spoke about my work without minimizing it. I admitted what I was still learning without apologizing for it. When it ended, the interviewer smiled. We'll be in touch, she said. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment. Let the adrenaline drain. Let the possibility exist without grabbing it. Dinner, Mom asked how it went. Good, I said. That's it. That's it. She nodded slowly, like she was recalculating again. Dad smiled, brief and tight. Then shrugged. No one clapped. No one celebrated. No one dismissed it either. Later, alone in my room, I realized something quietly monumental. I didn't need their reaction to validate what I'd just done. I had shown up fully. That was mine, regardless of outcome. For years, I'd been told not to get ahead of myself. Not to expect too much. Not to want too loudly. But sitting there, in the afterglow of effort honestly spent, I understood the cost of that lesson. It wasn't humility. It was containment. And I was done being contained. The call came 2 days later, right when I was in the middle of work. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me not to. Dad's name lit up the screen, steady and familiar, the kind of call that usually came with a lecture disguised as advice. I was thinking about that interview, he said after a brief hello. It reminded me of when you were younger. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the ceiling. How so? You've always been capable, he said carefully. Even when you didn't have much. That's why we never worried about you. There it was. The reframe. Not neglect. Confidence. Not lack of support. Trust. I didn't have much because I wasn't given much, I replied evenly. He chuckled softly, like I'd misunderstood a fond memory. You're looking at it the wrong way. We wanted you to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficient. Another word that arrived late, usually after the damage had already been done. I became self-sufficient because I had to, I said. Not because it was some lesson you planned. He sighed. You don't have to be so harsh. Harsh. The word landed with familiar weight. I noticed how often honesty was labeled cruelty when it disrupted a comfortable story. I'm not being harsh, I replied. I'm being accurate. There was a pause, then his tone shifted, more casual. Anyway, your mother was saying that maybe if this job works out, you could help Ethan upgrade his setup later. He's really getting serious about gaming. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Clarity. So now my future income is already being allocated, I said quietly. That's not what I meant, he said quickly. Just, family helps family. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them. My income is not a family resource. The silence that followed was thick, surprised. Like he hadn't considered that possibility before. You're sounding distant again, he said. No, I replied. I'm sounding independent. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was cooler. You've changed. Yes, I said. I have. Call ended soon after, polite but strained. I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of my laptop, thinking about how easily my potential had been repackaged as future utility. How quickly my success triggered entitlement instead of pride. That evening, I wrote something down in my notes app. Not a response. A reminder. My progress is not a group project. I stared at the sentence until it felt permanent. Dinner, the mood was different. Finn talked about a new game release. Mom nodded along. Dad avoided my eyes. No one mentioned the interview. No one mentioned money. The absence felt intentional, like a temporary ceasefire rather than resolution. In my room later, I updated my budget again. Not out of fear. Out of foresight. I adjusted categories. Increased savings. Created a new line labeled growth. Felt strange and powerful to plan for expansion instead of survival. I realized then that they weren't just uncomfortable with my independence. They were unsettled by the fact that it removed leverage. I was no longer the easy solution. No longer the one who could be guilted into filling gaps. And once leverage disappears, so does control. I closed my laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling that had witnessed so many quiet compromises. For the first time, I wasn't rehearsing what I'd say next. I was deciding what I would no longer explain. The shift became obvious the moment they stopped asking and started assuming again. Not loudly. Quietly. In the background. Like gravity reasserting itself, expecting everything to fall back into place without discussion. It showed up in small comments. Side remarks. Casual statements that treated my time, my space, my resources as flexible, adjustable, available. Mom mentioned a bill at breakfast. Not asking. Just mentioning. Dad talked about an upcoming expense, eyes flicking toward me for half a second longer than necessary. Ethan joked about how nice it would be to have a faster internet plan now that everyone's working harder. None of it was explicit. That was the point. It was meant to slide past my defenses the way it always had. This time it didn't. I noticed how my body reacted differently. No immediate tightening. No rush to fix. No mental math about how I could help without hurting myself too much. The impulse to intervene rose, hovered, then dissolved. I watched it go with a strange sense of relief. At lunch, my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. Can you cover groceries this week? Things are a bit tight. I stared at the screen. Not angry. Not hurt. Just clear. This was the test. Not about food. About whether the door I'd closed was actually locked. I typed a response slowly. I can't. No explanation. No apology. No softening. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. disappeared again. That's disappointing, she wrote. After everything we've done. There it was. The invoice. Retroactive. Unlimited. I set the phone down and finished my lunch. When I picked it up again, I typed one more sentence. I'm managing my own expenses now. I hit send and put the phone face down. The house felt different that evening. Quieter. Sharper around the edges. Dad was distant. Mom moved through rooms with pointed efficiency. Finn stayed in his room, headset on, insulated from everything. No one confronted me. No one apologized. Tension just sat there, waiting for me to smooth it out. I didn't. In my room, I worked. Focused. Productive. Paid. I finished a project and sent the invoice without second-guessing the number. When the confirmation came back, I felt a surge of something close to pride. Not because of the money. Because I hadn't diluted my worth before presenting it. Later, Dad knocked on my door. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets. "Your mother's upset," he said. I nodded. "I know. She feels like you're pulling away." I met his eyes. "I'm pulling back. There's a difference." He frowned. "Families don't keep score." I thought about all the silent tallies I'd carried for years. All the times I'd paid and absorbed and adjusted without acknowledgement. "Families shouldn't keep score," I replied. "But they also shouldn't treat one person like the balance sheet." He didn't answer. He just stood there, then nodded once and walked away. That night, I packed a small bag. Not to leave forever. Just to create space. I booked a short stay nearby using money I'd earned with my new setup, my new boundaries. As I zipped the bag, I realized something important. Distance wasn't the threat. Tendency was. I left early the next morning. No announcement. No argument. Just a note on the counter. "I'll be back in a few days." Taking some space. The world didn't collapse. In the quiet of that temporary room, I slept deeply. I woke without dread. I worked without interruption. I ate without commentary. I existed without being assessed. For the first time, I wasn't resisting control. I was living outside of it. Leaving didn't feel dramatic. That was the strangest part. No slammed doors. No tearful confrontations. No final speeches delivered in a trembling voice. Felt quiet. Administrative. Like closing an account that had been draining interest for years and finally deciding the fees weren't worth it anymore. The days away stretched into a week. Then, too, I went back to the house once briefly to pick up the rest of my things. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. Mom stayed in the kitchen, clattering dishes louder than necessary. Dad was busy. Ethan didn't come out of his room. It was easier than I expected. That realization hurt more than any argument would have. I loaded my car slowly, deliberately. Each box felt symbolic in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of what I was taking, but because of what I wasn't. I left behind things I'd bought for the house. Small appliances. Extra linens. The spare charger everyone used. I didn't announce it. I didn't point it out. I just stopped supplying. When I drove away that time, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. My new place wasn't impressive. Smaller. Quieter. Entirely mine. I set it up gradually. One chair. One lamp. A desk by the window. I resisted the urge to over-prepare, to make it welcoming for hypothetical guests who might never come. This space wasn't for hosting. It was for existing. Work flourished in the absence of interruption. Without constant emotional background noise, my focus sharpened. I took on more projects. Charged appropriately. Declined ones that didn't respect my time. Each decision reinforced the next. A feedback loop of self-trust. Messages from my family became sporadic, mostly practical. Dad asking about mail, Mom sending passive updates, Ethan texting once to ask if I still had the login for something. I replied politely, briefly, without opening doors. The silence between messages grew longer. The expectation that I would fill it evaporated. One evening, weeks later, Mom called. Not texted. Called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice sounded smaller. Are you okay? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said, and meant it. She hesitated. We don't see you anymore. I know. We're your family. I know, I repeated. Then added calmly, and I'm still my own person. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She just sighed. Things feel different. They are, I said. Because I am. That was the entire conversation. Afterward, I sat in the quiet and felt something settle permanently. Not relief. Not triumph. Certainty. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Stopped hoping for a rewritten past. Stopped framing my life as a response to theirs. Months passed. My credit improved. My savings grew. I made plans that didn't include contingencies for other people's needs. I traveled lightly. I slept well. I laughed more, not because things were perfect, but because they were honest. Occasionally, guilt tried to resurface. A reflex. A leftover habit. But it had no traction anymore. Guilt requires belief. I no longer believed I was responsible for their comfort at the expense of my own survival. I learned something essential in the aftermath of everything. Revenge isn't loud. Doesn't announce itself. Doesn't demand witnesses. It doesn't even require confrontation. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to play the role that made someone else comfortable while it slowly erased you. They thought control came from money, from access, from obligation, from guilt disguised as love. They were wrong. Control dissolves the moment you stop volunteering. I didn't destroy my family. I outgrew the version of myself they needed me to be. And I didn't leave to punish them. I left to finally belong to myself.